Well, good morning again. My name's Jeremiah. I'm one of the pastors here, and I love this. I love that the two churches that they have are Hope Church and Grace Church. Hope and Grace is something that we can use a lot of. And we've been showing these videos because next week, each one of these sort of videos that we've shown over the last several weeks is one of our global partners as a part of our Legacy Project. And the Legacy Project, if you're not aware of it, is a way for us to say we want to leave a legacy beyond what takes place here at Westbridge Church, inside of the walls of this church. We want to leave a legacy that outlives our lives. We want the legacy of Westbridge Church not just to be about what happens here in our lives in St. Michael, Minnesota, but about what happens locally, what happens globally, and what happens for future generations. That even when our lives have ended and we've come and gone and given all that we can to move God's kingdom forward, that there will be people left after us who say, my life has changed as a result of those people living and their sacrifice and the things that they did and the things that they gave and the way that they lived and the way that they loved. And so we started this Legacy Project as a way for us to partner with global partners around the world. And we've been giving money to these global partners every single month. We take whatever you give here at Westbridge Church and we give a percentage of that away around the world. And so now, as we're planning trips to these areas in 2021, you get to go on a trip and see what your generosity is already doing. And so that's amazing. We'll have details for trips coming out in 2021 shortly in the next several weeks here, but keep that in mind. And then we also, our goal this year was to raise a bunch of money outside of that we could give away to local and global projects. And you have been so faithful in that. And so this next week, we're going to be receiving our legacy offering. And that's a way for us to say, above and beyond what we normally give, I want my life to leave a legacy. I'm going to give above and beyond what I normally give to the Legacy Project to make sure that we can continue to leave a legacy that outlives our lives. We want this to just be a part of the DNA of our church, that we are a group of people who don't just think about what's happening here and in our lifetime, but that we want to make ripples that outlive our lives. And that's what this is all about. And so each year during this time, this will be something that we'll do, or we'll say, what can we do above and beyond to give towards leaving a legacy in the world for God's kingdom? And so be praying about that. And here's what we said this year, because 2020 has been a crazy year, and to say the least. And so we said, what if every single one of us gave $20.20 for every member of our family? If we could all give $20.20 for every member of our family, every person who calls Westbridge Church their home, then we could potentially raise upwards of a minimum of $30,000 in one day to give away towards local projects that would help people, towards global projects that would help people, and for future generations. And so I know that for some of you, God's blessed you to the point that you can do more than that. And so we're excited. Our goal with this is that as a church, we would have 100% participation, and then we give 100% of it away. And so that's what we're doing. That's taking place next Sunday. I want to encourage you to pray about what God might have you to give as a part of our legacy offering. Now, we're jumping into week 2 of this series, Blind Spot. And Blind Spot is this thing, when I was a youth pastor, we did an event called Bigger and Better. And Blind Spot is something, this series that we're talking about is things that you didn't see coming. Things that you just didn't, you never saw it come. It's in your blind spot. You're unaware of it. You would change it if you could, but you're simply unaware. And when I was a youth pastor, we did this event called Bigger and Better. And here's the concept. We would put groups of students into teams, and every team of students started with something very small, like a penny or a paper clip. And then they had to go all over the city, and they had to try to make trades. And they'd have to trade their penny for something else and trade that for something else. And the whole point of it was bigger and better. And starting out with something small, see if you could come back with the biggest and the best thing. And I think the biggest thing, someone came back, I think the winning team came back with a sofa. It was amazing. It's like, you got that from a paperclip, and they just kept trading and trading and trading. There's a teenager in California named Steven Ortiz. Several years ago, he traded an old cell phone for a little bit better cell phone. And he traded that for an iPod Touch. He traded that for a dirt bike. He then traded that dirt bike for another dirt bike, and then he traded that dirt bike for a MacBook Pro. And then he traded the MacBook Pro for a 20-year-old Toyota 4Runner. Unbelievable. He was 15 years old. He couldn't even drive this thing. And yet he traded for it. And so then he traded that for a custom hot rod. And then he traded that for this this off-road, it was a hot rod off-road golf cart, because this was something he could legally drive. And so he started driving that around, and eventually he traded that for a street bike, and then another car, and then he ended up with a vintage 1975 Ford Bronco, and he traded the Bronco eventually for a Porsche Boxster S. 2 years, 14 trades, and he ended up going from a cell phone to a Porsche. It's absolutely amazing. So for many of us, that's the story of our life. The story of our life is that we're constantly trading our time, our energy, our opportunities for bigger and better. We have become black belts at getting stuff done. And then you add into all of the craziness and the speed and the pace of life that we were already on, you add into it this year that we call 2020. And now you've got pandemic, and you've got a social injustice and unrest around racial injustice and intense political drama and economic collapse and 24-hour news cycle and constant division on social media. And the result for many of us is that we're drained. We're drained emotionally, we're drained physically, we're drained mentally, we're drained relationally. Many of us are just drained, or drained spiritually. In fact, some of the phrases I hear from people a lot are, I'm just overwhelmed. I'm overscheduled, I'm exhausted. And I hear those things from young people, and I hear those things from less young people. I hear those things from people with lots of resources, and I hear those things from people with few resources. I hear those things from men and women. I hear those things from Republicans and Democrats. I hear those things from every different group of people that you can imagine, that life has thrown us such a curveball this year. And honestly, I think for many of us mentally, we thought, okay, this is gonna last a few weeks. And it has gone on and on and on. And we're to the point now where I think we're mentally and emotionally and spiritually and physically exhausted. And then you add in the incredible social pressure that has been placed on us this year with our cancel culture. And you're constantly living on eggshells because you might say something or do something that will offend someone and be taken the wrong way. And when you live under these conditions long enough, the result is just mental and emotional exhaustion. Anybody else exhausted? Does this resonate with anybody, or is it, I feel like this is everyone I know. And here's what this is. Exhaustion happens when the demands placed on you exceed the resources within you. When the demands placed on you are greater than the resources that are within you, you become exhausted. And every once in a while we hear a story about some CEO or some leader of a large organization who just can't take the pressure, they just can't take the demands anymore, and they end up making a really bad moral decision or a really horrible personal decision. It costs them their position. And I'd say for most of us, we suffer from what sociologists call stress contamination. Stress contamination, which is this: you have so many different points of stress that it's not just one thing. It's not like, man, if this one thing was solved, my life would be so much better, right? It's coming at you from all sides. It's where you can't really point to any one specific thing. You're just surrounded by so many demands that your internal resources can't keep up, and you feel pressure all the time. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? And the average office worker in America receives 121 emails every day and sends out 40 emails every day. And texts add into that text messages, add into that inter-office communications, and the demands on the average person is incredibly high. It's only increasing. And that's just one stress point. Your job, right? That's one stress point. And then on top of that, most of us are surrounded on a daily basis by a ringing telephone, and then fussy children or overdue bills, or the plumbing issues at the house, or the car breaks down, kids' sports practices, insanely busy schedules. And it's easy to let the demands build to the point where we let our internal resources, who we are as a person, simply can't keep up with all of the demands, and we just become exhausted. And many of you can probably identify one area in your mind right now. You're like, man, this would be a big one. Like, if I could just experience some relief in this area, I think it would relieve some of that pressure that I feel. How many of you would say, man, I'm sitting next to someone right now who really looks like they've identified some stress in their life? How many of you would say, I'm sitting next to the stress in my life? No, just kidding. For many of us, what we experience is this low-grade exhaustion. And it's happening beneath the surface. And we're slowly sort of burning out on the inside, but we simply push ourselves forward. And we push ourselves forward another day. We push ourselves forward another week. We push ourselves forward another month. Right? And there's a light at the end of the tunnel. It's going to get better. This is just a season. We're going to get through this. We're going to get through this. We're going to get through this. And we've been telling ourselves that week after week and month after month and season after season. And we don't realize what it's actually doing to us on the inside. C.S. Lewis once wrote about how things affect us internally. He said this: mental pain is less traumatic than physical pain, but it is more common and also more difficult to bear. The frequent attempt to conceal mental pain increases the burden. It's easier to say my tooth is aching than to say my heart is broken. Because when you're exhausted mentally and emotionally and spiritually, it's not something that you project. It's something that you constantly feel like you've just got to cover it up, and you can't really expose that to too many people. And so as a result, you become even more exhausted from trying to cover up your exhaustion. And it creates this downward spiral, and it's this cycle. And I think we're at this sort of point in our country, we're at this point in our community where it's like, man, we're all feeling the effects of this. It says in Proverbs 18, the human spirit can endure a sick body, but who can bear a crushed spirit? And there's different degrees of crushed spirit. I'll acknowledge that. My son has a crushed spirit every time we don't have pizza for dinner. Right? So different levels of crushed spirit. But the very meaning of the words crushed spirit indicate that an individual's outlook on life has become distorted. That, they've lost the joy of really living. That's what exhaustion does to us. And we really don't see it coming. I mean, it's one of those things that's in our blind spot. It's one of those things that we're not aware how exhausted and how worn down and how difficult it's gotten until we hit sort of a breaking point. And I think it's fascinating when you look at some of the accounts in the scriptures of people that God used. People that God used in really incredible ways. They often experienced and wrote about or documented their extreme emotions and dealing with the demands that are placed on them. In fact, Moses wrote this: I can't carry all these people by myself. The load is far too heavy. If this is how you intend to treat me, just go ahead and kill me. Do me a favor and spare me this misery. That's Moses in a prayer to God. If this is how you're going to treat me, then you may as well just put me out of my misery. The prophet Jeremiah, he wrote this: I curse the day I was born. May no one celebrate the day of my birth. I curse the messenger who told my father, good news, you have a son. Why was I ever born? My entire life has been filled with trouble, sorrow, and shame. That's the prophet Jeremiah. Curse everyone associated with my birth and my birthday and the day I was even born. The guy who brought the news and said, congratulations, you have a son. Curse him. In fact, Jeremiah was known as the weeping prophet, which I gotta tell you, when you have the name Jeremiah and you grow up in church world and people know that, just saying. Elijah wrote this: I've had enough, Lord. This is a prayer, actually. He says, I've had enough, Lord. Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who have already died. Job says this: I'd rather die than suffer like this. I hate my life, and I don't want to go on living. Jonah, just kill me now, Lord. I'd rather be dead than alive. Paul, actually, he does write this: we were crushed and overwhelmed beyond our ability to endure, and we thought we would never live through it. In fact, we expected to die. I think we sometimes get the idea that the people that God uses throughout history are these magnificent saints with incredible faith, and they never have doubts, and they never have struggles, and they never experience extreme emotions. And they were never mentally and emotionally drained, right? I mean, they just kind of floated around on clouds and played harps, and God used them, right? And the reality is, they don't apologize for what they're feeling. They simply reach a point where they cry out and they express it. And if you're not sure if you're there, here are a few signs to let you know, I might be at this point of being drained. I might be at this point of mental and emotional exhaustion. Number one, you're emotionally numb. If you're numb, if your heart feels numb, you might be emotionally or mentally depleted. You're designed to celebrate when people celebrate. You're designed to mourn when people mourn. But if the demands placed on you exceed the resources that are within you for an extended period of time, at some point, something's got to give. And oftentimes, we have become numb and we don't even realize it. It's in our blind spot. And if your passion has faded, if you feel just emotionally just numb, you may be experiencing low-grade exhaustion and not even realize it. Or how about this? Number two, you're disproportionately emotional. This is the other end of the extreme from numb, right? The littlest things set you off. The dishwasher didn't get emptied and you just flew off the rails. Or one of your kids spills their juice and you act like the house just burned down. It's just like, it just sets you off. If something that is a 1 on the problem scale sends you to an 11 on the reaction scale, then you might be experiencing a mental and emotional exhaustion. How about this? Number 3, decreased focus and awareness. Decreased focus and awareness. Does it take more effort for you, more effort to produce less? Do you find yourself not as focused? Do you find yourself distracted? Do you find yourself just going through the motions? Are you losing sight of the big picture? Because decreased awareness, you'll feel like you're on the hamster wheel, right? Addressing whatever new emergency demands your attention that day, but you don't feel like you're gaining any ground. And it might be because you're not as focused. You lack awareness. And this is when we tend to make emotional decisions in the moment that can cost us long term. This is when we start to make emotional decisions here and now, and we don't stop to think about what the consequences will be down the road. But our awareness and our focus is simply decreased because of exhaustion. Or maybe it's number 4, relationship fatigue. Does everybody get on your nerves? Are you weary of people? Now, I get there's going to be some people who will drain you. There's some people who, get on your nerves. But if everybody drains you, if everybody gets on your nerves, they're not the problem. You are. And if you find yourself getting irritated by the people in your life that you love the most and with whom you should be experiencing the most joy in life, then you may need to check yourself for potential exhaustion. Number 5, spiritual emptiness. When you feel mentally and emotionally exhausted, God feels distant. Now, it doesn't mean God is distant, but because you are emotionally and mentally depleted, God feels distant. And we pray, but we don't feel like God really hears our prayers. And maybe you read the scriptures for encouragement, but it just doesn't feel like it makes an impact. And we may engage in the life of the church, but it feels more routine than life-giving. Exhaustion causes us to become numb to the presence and activity of God in our lives, not because he's not active, but because we've stopped recognizing or feeling gratitude for what he's doing in our lives. And finally, maybe you're at this point, number 6, you practice self-medication over self-care. When you're exhausted, the natural tendency is to self-medicate. And that might be overeating, or overworking, or sexual addictions, or drinking, or impulsive spending, or drugs. And when this happens, you've chosen a path of self-medication instead of self-care. Instead of looking after yourself, you try to medicate because you just want to drown out the feeling and the emotions that are associated with what you're experiencing. And people who are experiencing this burnout and exhaustion almost always choose self-medication of some kind over self-care. And some of you might be really alarmed right now. Some of you are hearing this and you're going, dude, 6 out of 6. I'm in trouble. Or maybe you're like, man, I know someone who really is, sort of ticking the meter into the red on a lot of these. Maybe you're concerned for a spouse or a close friend who's exhibiting many of these symptoms. And if that's you, I'd encourage you, seek out professional help. Talk to somebody, because there is nothing weak about getting help. There is nothing weak about saying, hey, I'm struggling and I really need someone to talk to. A skilled counselor can help you identify these issues and work through these issues. But for many of us, we're functional burnouts, right? It's like we're experiencing low-grade exhaustion, but we're still able to function day to day. We just don't realize the long-term damage that it's doing beneath the surface. And I can tell you that if you live in low-grade exhaustion long enough, it's going to lead you to a breakdown at some point. You cannot sustain that kind of living. So why do we allow ourselves to get that far before we seek help? I can give you a couple of reasons. Pride and fear. That's pretty much why. Pride and fear. Pride says, I can handle it. I got this. I don't need help. I'm fine. I got this. It's not a problem. And then all of a sudden we realize, you know what? I don't got this. This is a problem. But now we've already told people, I got this. So now this is when fear steps in. And fear says, I don't want anybody to know that I couldn't handle this. What will they think? And so pride and fear kind of drive this cycle of exhaustion in our life. And I want to encourage you, I want to respectfully submit, don't let pride and fear drive exhaustion in your life, robbing you of the joy that Jesus came to offer. Instead, I think there's a much better way. And I think there's this invitation from Jesus for us to live a very different way. In fact, Jesus says this, come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle, and you will find rest for your souls. Does anybody besides me need rest for your soul right now? I think that is the perfect thing that we need. Rest for our souls. When you are mentally and emotionally exhausted, rest for your soul is like a cold cup of water on a hot summer day. You know deep down it's exactly what you need. I need rest for my soul. I need my soul to be replenished and to be renewed and to be rejuvenated. And so this is what Jesus comes to offer. Jesus comes into our world and he says, look, there's all kinds of things that you can carry, but what if you took on and carried my burden? It's actually light. If you'll come to me when you feel weary, when you feel heavy laden, you'll find rest for your soul. Take my yoke upon you. This is an interesting phrase, and we've talked about this before, but this yoke is something that goes on a pair of oxen to keep them moving together as you'd plow. And Jesus says, take my yoke upon you. In other words, tie yourself up to me. Live my way. Move in my direction. Move in lockstep with the way that I say to live life. And when you do that, your soul will be replenished. And folks, I think we need a whole lot of that. And so how do you access this rest for your soul? How can I live today in such a way that I can thrive tomorrow? Here's some practical things. And I want today to be very, very practical to help us as we move through this season. So I want to give you some really, really practical things that you can begin to put into practice today to help you so that you can begin to thrive. Number one, tell someone you are struggling. Tell someone. If you're struggling, if you're experiencing low-grade burnout or exhaustion, you're mentally and emotionally depleted, then tell somebody. You cannot go it alone. This is difficult because pride and fear really do work a number on us. And whatever you do, if you're suspicious that you might be experiencing exhaustion, don't keep it to yourself. It only gets worse over time. And I hate to be the one to tell you this, but we're heading into a season here called winter where you start to build up, and it's going to snow a whole bunch. I know you already know this. And when it snows, as you drive, this happens to me every year, the ice and the snow and all of the stuff gets built up around my wheel well. And I love to wait until I'm not in my garage to kick that out. I love to wait till I'm in your driveway, and then I get that stuff all loose. Or when I'm in the parking lot of a different location, that's when I get in there and kick all that stuff free. But the reality is it just builds up over time. Excuse me. And you can get to the point where you're driving down the road and your car is literally shaking from the amount of stuff that gets built up in there. And We are heading into this season where that's what happens. If you don't get it out of there periodically throughout the winter and clean out those wheel wells, what happens is it builds up and it builds up and it builds up. I got to the point at one point last year, my car was violently shaking as I was driving down the road. And I had to literally, I'm like, what is going on? And finally, I got underneath the wheel wells and I cleaned it all out, drove like a dream. And here's the reality. Emotions are a lot like snow built up in the wheel well of your car. Over time, you've got to clean that out. If you don't deal with them, they build up, and the mental and emotional exhaustion starts to take its toll. It gets lodged in your heart, and in the silence, it grows. And it grows, and it grows. And if you fear that you are struggling, please tell someone. Don't face it alone. Don't face it alone. Number 2, do what fuels you. What is it that fills your tank? What is it that gets you up in the morning? What is it that you look forward to and energizes you that you want to do more of? Do more of that. I'll tell you, here's the things that fill me. I love music. I love sports and basketball and family activities. I love reading. I get up a couple of hours before everybody else in our family, typically on most mornings, and I'm able to sit down with some coffee and sit in front of the fireplace and read before everybody gets up in the hustle and bustle of the day, and it just energizes me and it fills me and starts my day off right. I enjoy relationships and friendships, and these things fill me up. Here's things that drain me. Negative people drain me. Planning events drains me. Negative people drain me. Busy work drains me. Negative people drain me. Cats drain me. I know some of you love your cats, and that's okay. You have the right to be wrong. No problem. All right. But here's the deal. What is it that fills you and what is it that drains you? What is it that fills you up? What is it that sort of sucks the life out of you and sucks the energy out of you? And do whatever you can. And obviously there's things that we just have to do as a way of living life. But if you could do more of the things that actually fill you, you would be so much happier. One of the ways to begin to recover from exhaustion is to begin to live today in a way that helps you thrive tomorrow. And so maybe make a list this week of what are the things that bring life to my soul? What are the things that bring life to my heart, that make me smile, that, put a smile on my face and cause me to be filled with joy? Maybe if I spent more time doing some of those things, which is actually self-care instead of self-medication. I love what it says in Ecclesiastes. Using a dull axe requires great strength, so sharpen the blade. And when you do things that fill you with life, it's like you're sharpening the blade. And then when you do things that you've got to do that you don't necessarily love, it's easier. You're more focused, you're more aware because you're filled up. Number 3, understand the balance of life. Here's what this means. You have to adjust the balance of life. You have to adjust the balance of life. Life, I've heard this so much throughout my life, that the goal of life is to have a balanced life. Maybe. But I think that there's a misnomer to that, because when you think about how balance works, you have to make adjustments during certain seasons. There are certain seasons where if you want to balance something, it feels like, something's heavy on this side, now it's getting out of balance. And the way that we do that is we think, well, I've got to go over to this side and I've got to balance things out. But really the way that you create balance is you actually adjust the fulcrum along where that balance is. So if you're trying to balance something, the goal is not, this is heavy on this side, so I better do something on this side to balance that out. What you do is you adjust the fulcrum. That means, okay, this is a season right now where this is taking up more of my time and energy. I've got to adjust and I've got to put more energy and time and focus into this through this season. That will bring balance to the rest of my life. There's a season where my job needs more attention. So I'm just going to have to get through that season, but I'm adjusting the balance. So now I'm going to shift and wherever I can to create more time with my family. There's a season where your family's going through something and you adjust the balance and you spend more time with family and say, hey, work, here's what I have to do. Here's where I'm creating balance in my life. Balance does not mean simply if there's a season of work, I've got to spend more time with family. There are seasons. There are adjustments that you have to make, and you have to adjust the balance of life. You may be in a very busy season. You may be in a very light season. You may be in a season where you want to focus on something different. Adjust the focus, and you're able to adjust the fulcrum of your balance in life. Number 4, plan your rest. This is so important. Jesus built rest into his life. If anyone could have excused himself for being too busy, it would have been Jesus. Everybody wanted something from Jesus: time, attention, focus, advice, healing. But as he gained popularity, here's what we read. Jesus often withdrew to the wilderness for prayer. Can I tell you something? People who crash and burn do not do so because they are evil. Most of the time, people who crash and burn, they do so because they're frail. And they haven't taken the time to rest and re-strengthen and replenish. And people don't usually make horrible moral or financial decisions or relational decisions because they're evil, but because they're on the edge of mental or emotional exhaustion, and they simply aren't making wise decisions during that season. We must plan times of rest. God never intended for you and I to live full throttle all the time. And if we don't learn to make some room for the important things in our life, we'll end up looking back at various seasons of our life with lots of regrets. The soil needs rest to reproduce crops. The trees lie dormant for a season, and then they come back into bloom. The world that you and I inhabit has this rhythm worked into it, and it is in us as well. It's why we sleep every night. We're replenishing. There's a rhythm to life, and rest makes your life sustainable. When we first started Westbridge, I was burning the candle at both ends. I was working a full-time job, and we were having kids, and we were trying to get the church off the ground, and I'm telling you, it catches up to you. Sleep is like debt, and you have to pay it back at some point. And so plan some times of rest, relax, and refuel your soul so that you can be stronger for the next season. Number 5, grieve your losses. This is so important. When you think about your life, it could be described as a series of ungrieved losses. Your best friend moves out of state. A much-loved uncle dies. You get passed over for a promotion that you thought you had in the bag. Your parents get divorced after 25 years of marriage. Your car, you thought it was going to last a couple more years, and now that bill is piling up on you. Your spouse contracts an illness. And what happens is that we don't have the time to stop and appropriately grieve. And so we just go back to work. We get on with life, and just because you're hurting doesn't mean that the demands of the outside world stop, and we've just got to put on a brave face, and we've got to keep going and put one foot in front of the other day after day. But taking the time to grieve is actually one of the healthiest things you can do for your soul. If you don't grieve these hurts, eventually they start to stack up one season after another. So you've got to grieve your losses and declutter your heart and emotions so that you can rest and continue to thrive in life and not just simply survive. Life is a series of ungrieved losses, but we've got to learn to grieve those things. And then finally, number 6, stay connected to Jesus. I know it's like, of course you're going to say that. This is church. You're the preacher. That's the preacher answer. And I think it's so important that we regularly take time to connect with Jesus in meaningful ways. Because when we do that, we find the strength. When I connect with Jesus, I find the strength to be the husband that I need to be the dad that I need to be the friend that I need to be the pastor that I need to be. In fact, the Apostle Paul wrote this to followers of Jesus in Corinth. He says, "We are pressed on every side by troubles, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but not driven to despair. We are hunted down, but never abandoned by God. We get knocked down, but we get up again. You're never going to keep me down." I can never read this verse without thinking Chumbawamba. I'm sorry. Just have to know that. We get knocked down, but we are not destroyed. We're pressed, but we're not crushed. We're perplexed, but not driven to despair. We're hunted down, but never abandoned by God. We get knocked down, but we are not destroyed. A few verses later, he tells them why. That is why we never give up. Though our bodies are dying, our spirits are being renewed every day. Paul says, in spite of all the things that this life has thrown at us, we're able to endure because our spirit is continually being renewed with Jesus. How are you faithfully and consistently connecting with Jesus? What does it look like for you? How are you engaging with what Jesus is up to in our world? How are you attaching your heart to that passion? If you don't, mental and emotional exhaustion might be right around the corner. And you don't see it coming. It's in your blind spot. And listen, mental and emotional exhaustion happens when we're simply depleted. And we can blame life, and we can blame our employer, and we can blame our family, and we can blame our circumstances, but ultimately, we are in charge of ourselves. I'm in charge of me, you're in charge of you. And so what choice could you make this week to help you? Maybe you would say, I need to recognize I'm experiencing exhaustion. I need to grieve some losses, or I need to tell someone, I need to get some help. I recognize that I'm getting close to this point where I could potentially experience a crash, and I want to make some changes before it costs me. And just because this might be your present, it does not have to be your future. So what is the next right step that God is asking you to take to help you heal and to help you live the kind of life that God created you to live? And I want to encourage you, if you've never made the decision to follow Jesus, you're invited to do that. I genuinely believe this. Following Jesus will make your life better and will make you better at life. Because you were created by God to live in loving community with Him and with others. And you've been invited to that. And it isn't based on anything you've done, it's based on who God is and His love for you. If you've never said yes to that invitation, I want to invite you to say yes as we pray. God, please forgive my sins. Forgive me for the times where I've walked away from you. And I pray, adopt me into your family. Make me your son, make me your daughter, and help me to put my trust in you and to follow you as best as I know how from this moment on. And God, for every one of us, we're in a season where I think a lot of us are experiencing depletion, exhaustion. God, we're in a season where a lot of us are experiencing burnout, mentally, emotionally, relationally, spiritually, just drained. And I pray for healing. I pray that you'd restore our souls. I pray that you would fill us up with joy and peace and hope and grace. We commit our week to you. I pray this in your name. Amen.